It's hard to believe that I've been using the M4 iPad Pro now for around about 8 months, and on the whole, it's been a really good experience. But as with everything iPad, there are pros and cons, and one of the negatives really surprised me. Hi, my name's David, this is Talking Tech, and this is where we talk about Apple intelligently. The M4 iPad Pro was my first dip into iPad life. I'd had a couple of minis before that, but never really used them, but I was just curious to know what an iPad Pro was like and what iPad life was like. And I suppose you could honestly say that I kind of gave myself the best possible option of liking an iPad by going for the Rolls Royce of iPads. I went for the brand new M4 iPad Pro, and I didn't hold back on when I was speccing it out either. I went for the large one, the 13-inch iPad Pro. I went with 1 terabyte storage, originally with the Nano-texture display on it as well. I didn't go for Wi-Fi. I think that was the only option I didn't choose at the time, but I did include the Apple Pencil and also the Magic Keyboard, which meant that on the day that I bought this iPad Pro, I spent just short of £2,500, which is going to mean one of two things. I'm either bonkers, or I'm really intrigued to see if I can make this iPad work in my workday, in my workspace, and in my workflow. Remember that I just mentioned that I had a niggle, a concern, one of the cons about the iPad. Well, that's the battery life, and it's fair to say, in my experience at least, it's been a Jekyll and Hyde situation. Some days it's good, some days it's bad. Now, when the iPad came out, I think we all had concerns as to what the battery life was going to be like because this thing is so slim, and Apple seems to be moving into their slim era once again. Now, the battery inside of this iPad, in theory, should be decent. It's a 10,340 milliamp hour battery, which is bigger than its predecessor, quite a lot bigger than its predecessor. But of course, what I meant when I said Jekyll and Hyde is that if I say compare it to the iPad mini, if it's just on standby, just on my desk, I can pick up the iPad mini, and that is the A17 mini that I've got, the newest one. I can pick that up after a few days of being on my desk, and the battery has hardly moved. Whereas I go to pick up the iPad Pro if it's been sitting on a desk, idle, doing nothing for a few days, and the battery drains. And not only that, the real problem I have is with where you start off the day using the iPad Pro. If you start off with a full charge on the battery, it seems that 100 down to kind of the 50% area, that's fine. It lasts most of the day. But if you start off the day with the battery at 50, 60%, it seems to drain and dump really, really quickly. And that's with not many apps open. I was working on it the other day. I was just writing a script for this video. I didn't have any background apps open. All that I had going was some music, which I was using my AirPods Max to listen to. So yeah, Bluetooth was involved. But I started off there at around about 45%. And within an hour, it had already gone down to 30%, which isn't really what I would have expected when I was only writing on it. But as I say, if you start off the day with a full charge, it seems to last longer. So for people out there that are more clever than me, explain to me why that should be. Now, I'm not saying that the iPad battery is bad, but it's just not quite as reliable, I guess, as I was hoping it would be. Now, part of the reason for the battery's checkered performance might be because of one of its strengths, and that is the display. The display on this iPad Pro is just gorgeous. It keeps staggering me every time I open up to use it, just how good it is. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been lucky. I've worked on some great displays over recent years. My 5K Retina display on the 27-inch iMac was fantastic. The 27-inch Studio display is good. The Liquid Retina XDR display on my M1 Max MacBook Pro, all great displays, but by comparison to the tandem OLED display on this iPad, they all fail. It's really bright, it's really vivid, and it's super punchy. It'll give you 1,000 nits of SDR brightness and 1,600 nits of brightness for HDR content. But if you run it at full brightness, that's when you really will begin to notice the battery dumping really quickly. But that said, it is so bright that oftentimes I don't actually have it running at full brightness. And that's coming from somebody that loves bright displays. My Studio display, the iMac behind me are all at max brightness virtually all of the time. I love bright displays, but this powerful display is so bright, oftentimes I find I can just crank it down that little bit and save a little bit of that precious battery life as well. And it's such a good display that anything that is color critical in my workflow now, I turn to the iPad routinely. All of the thumbnail shots you see, all of those pictures start off as raw images, and I edit them in Lightroom on the iPad with the pencil because that display is more trustworthy and it's more color accurate. The same is true with the videos. Before you see the video, I watch it umpteen times, trying to make sure there's no errors, no mistakes. And the last pass I do is always on the M4 iPad Pro. And that's when I'm looking at color grading and any mistakes I may have made, because it will just highlight things really vividly to me if I've made any mistakes in the edit. You know, I was almost forced into spending more than I needed to simply because I wanted to try the Nano-texture display on my iPad Pro for myself. What I didn't realize at the time is I could have saved myself a load of money and had all the benefits of the Nano-texture display if only I'd known about this, the Paperlike for iPad. This is the original paper-filled screen protector that started it all, and it's still the best, which is why millions of people around the world turn to it, not only to protect their iPads, but it's also the one that will give you the most authentic paper-like feeling when you're writing, drawing, or taking notes. Not only, as you can see, are they simple to apply, but there are other benefits as well. They'll protect your iPad from scratches, and as you get 2 screen protectors, when the time comes, you can replace it at no extra cost. My initial reaction, well, I was shocked actually. Honestly, I don't think I can get over to you in this video quite how realistic it feels. It feels as if you are literally using a pen in a notebook on a piece of paper. It's uncanny how realistic it feels. That authentic feeling that you get is all down to a proprietary finish they use. It's called nanodots, which are tiny microbeads that make the feeling of the Paperlike so realistic and tactile. Not only will it reduce unwanted glare and reflections, but unlike Apple's Nano-texture, the Paperlike also gives you some haptic feedback as well. And since I've started using the Paperlike on my iPad Pro, I am now converted. You can buy them directly from Paperlike, Amazon, and over 50 retailers worldwide. They're available for iPad Pro, iPad Air, and iPad Mini. I've always been a little bit cautious about using aftermarket screen protectors, but unlike other cheap imitations, this one actually feels as if it was genuinely engineered with the iPad in mind. And now I've tried Paperlike, I'm going to get one for my iPad Mini as well. And if you want to experience Paperlike for yourself, I'll leave a link in the description where you can get yours. And carrying on with the display, you remember I bought the 1TB version of this iPad? Well, that was really so I could try out the Nano-texture. In the end, I decided not to keep it. I used it for a couple of weeks and then swapped it out for a display that hasn't got the Nano-texture on it. Does it work? Hell yes, it works. Is it for everybody? No. It's really hard for me to kind of explain to you here what it's like, but all I would say to you is consider what your use cases are, what you're going to be using it for, and first and foremost, go in store and have a look at it. Honestly, when you see the difference between the Nano-texture display and the display without Nano-texture, you'll know what I'm getting at. It's brilliant at what it does, but it's not for everyone. But something I don't get with the Nano-texture display is why Apple have locked it down to just the 1TB and 2TB models. I can't think of a solid reason that they would do that. Well, you could say it's because they feel it's a pro finish, but equally, I think it's more just greed. They're trying to push you, if you want the Nano-texture, you've got to buy that 1TB or 2TB model with the uplift that goes with it. Sometimes a little bit of good grace would go a long way from Apple. I know it's not necessarily their way, but I can't think of another reason why they've locked that onto the 2 most expensive models only. Now, some people criticize the aspect ratio on the iPad. It doesn't really trouble me, but I know some people that watch a lot of movies don't particularly like the 4:3 aspect ratio on the iPad Pro, and some people say they prefer the Samsung Galaxy S10, which is more of a native movie display to it. All I can tell you is when I watch Apple TV on here, or Netflix on here, or movies on here, it's not really an issue. And I'll tell you why. Once again, I'm coming back to it. Because that display is so immersive. Once you begin watching content into it, you forget what's around you. Now, the M4 iPad Pro, of course, has a ProMotion display on it. Am I the perfect market for it? Probably not. I'm not a gamer. Most of the work I do on the iPad is static kind of work, so I don't get the best out of it. But it does drop down all the way to 10 Hertz and all the way up to 120 Hertz, so it is a full ProMotion display. And I guess if you are a gamer on it, that's where it comes into its own, but it's not something that I really get hung up on. But all I can tell you is that the display, as you might have gathered, is a huge win for me when it comes to this new M4 iPad Pro. And by the way, if this is one of the first videos of mine you've stumbled across and you enjoy the content, take a look around the channel, see if it's for you. And if you like the look of it, a sub really does go a long way. I think there's going to be a lot of new products coming out from Apple over the next few months. That sub will really help me being able to get my hands on all this gear, which I have to buy myself, review it for you, and bring it to you on the channel. So if you're enjoying this video, if you've enjoyed some of the other videos you may have seen on the channel, sub really helps. And by the way, turn on notifications as well. So when I upload a video, which I do every single week, you will be the first to know. I/O. Now, again, this is an iPad Pro, and on the face of it, this iPad has got the same I/O basically as any other iPad. It's just got one single port, albeit it's a Thunderbolt 4 port, but it's still only got one single port. Now, recently, of course, I've been spoiled by the crazy fast speeds of the Thunderbolt 5 ports on the back of my M4 Pro Mac Mini. But this Thunderbolt 4 port on the M4 iPad Pro isn't exactly shady when it comes to speed. It gives you up to 40 gigabytes per second of data transfer, and that's quick enough, certainly quick enough to hook up an external SSD to it and to work meaningfully and properly from it. Also, of course, it means it's quick enough if you want to import big files onto your iPad. Rather than waiting for data to sync via the cloud, you can just dump big files onto there quickly enough. And as I said, the main thing is you can work from external SSDs. Now, this is another area that I've talked about recently on other videos, the way that these external SSDs are just changing. They've been a real revelation to me. Now, possibly you've been using them for years. You know, with me, I tell you the honest truth. I've only recently started using them, and they have changed the way that I would spec up anything I'm buying now from Apple, because you don't need to go mad with Apple's expensive SSD storage. You can use these external SSDs, and it works really well on the iPad. And you can even reformat the disks on the iPad now. And to that point, it's important when you're speccing up or looking at your iPad Pro that you're careful in what you're choosing. The bigger iPads, the 1 and 2 terabyte versions that I've mentioned here, they've got 16 gigs of unified memory. The lower versions, 256 and 512, have only got 8 gigs of memory. Now, that 8 gigs of memory is going to be more than enough for virtually everybody. And to be honest with you, it probably would have been enough for me. Choose one of those lower models and just use your own cheaper external SSDs. Honestly, it is the way forward. These ports that Apple are giving us now on our devices are so quick. It's a meaningful way to saving money when you're speccing up your Apple gear. It would be lovely if Apple could have just given us another port. It would have been really useful. As much as the Thunderbolt 4 port opens up a world of opportunities, if they'd given us another port, even if it was just a USB-C port, this is a Pro device, so we should have more options than any other iPad. And I think it would just be a nice touch, a really handy touch to have a second port on here that we could have used for other peripherals as well. Small point, I know, but again, this is a Pro device and you're paying a lot of money for it. And on to the elephant in the room that's always just lurking around the corner when we talk about iPads, and that is multitasking. Oh, and also iPadOS. Talking about multitasking, first of all, as you're probably well aware, there are 2 basic ways you can multitask. On the iPad, you've either got Stage Manager or you've got Split View and Slide Over. Now, I prefer the latter. I find Stage Manager to be a bit cumbersome, a bit messy on the screen. It doesn't, yes, you can have 4 windows open. So if you want to go that route of having 4 windows open at any one time, you've got Stage Manager for that. But equally, I prefer working most of the time in Split View, where I can say have Ulysses that I write in on one side of the screen and Safari on the other side of the screen for looking up reference points and so on. That works really well for me. So I don't really get that you're limited with multitasking options. You can have up to 4 windows open. I don't know how much more you'd want to do at any one time on your iPad. And that's before we begin looking at the point of using an external display. If you use an external display, once again, it gives you that second display. You can drag windows onto there, have windows open on your iPad, and you've got so many options open to you then. And another feature that I'm really keen about is Sidecar. I know it's been around forever, but I don't see many people using it. And I don't know why. Not only does it give you immediately a second display to your MacBook Pro or to the studio display, but it's just a fantastic way of quickly working, dragging other windows across and opening up your multitasking options and possibilities. Honestly, I don't really see that multitasking is that big of an issue on the iPads. Then on to the OS. Now, this is just a personal take. I know I'm probably going to get some heat on this, and it'll probably be the area that gets the most comments on this video. But I think most of the problems with OS aren't down to necessarily the iPad and iPadOS. It's down more to developers. They're not investing enough, the dev teams aren't investing enough into making their apps suitable for iPad, which is a real shame because that becomes a pinch point then and a reason to not reach for the iPad. I'm not a Microsoft Office user. I know a lot of you are, and apparently that runs really poorly on the iPads. But that, again, that's not down to Apple, it's not down to iPad, it's not down to iPadOS, that's down to the dev teams at Microsoft and Office to make it more optimized for iPad. Now, there's another instance, I can think of 2 instances. YouTube Studio, for instance, doesn't let me do Split View. It's really frustrating. If I want to answer comments, I could have emails open on one side, YouTube Studio on the other side to answer comments. But their app doesn't support Split View. I mentioned that I use Ulysses to write in. When I'm writing, I use Grammarly to check my spelling and text and so on. Grammarly is a real pain to use on the iPad. You have to go through this complete workaround of typing, then lifting the iPad out of the Magic Keyboard, initiating Grammarly, doing all the corrections, or putting it back in once it's initiated to carry on working. And it's just clumsy. And it's that sort of thing that sometimes makes me reach for the Mac rather than the iPad, just because it's more seamless and it's easier and quicker. And if we could sort out some of these pinch points, it would just make reaching for the iPad a more natural and the first thing that you would want to reach for to work on. But I'm not for a moment sitting here saying that Apple is blameless and faultless. There are things they could do to improve the experience on iPadOS, and I'd start that with multi-user login. It's been a long-term point that people have been raising, and I think fairly so. Again, it comes back down to greed from Apple. To expect people in a home where there's more than one person using the iPad to go and buy separate iPads, it's just a folly. It's ridiculous. You should be able to have multi-user login. You can do it on Mac, why not on iPad? And also, there's another area I think they could improve upon, and that is with the Files app. Now, the Files app is kind of as close as you get to the Finder on Mac, and It's really important, I've learned at least, it's really important to iPad life. Once you start working with external files or want to find files on your iCloud, you need to use the Files app. For the time being, the best workaround I found is just to put it in the dock. At least then the Files app is readily accessible. But if somehow the guys at Apple could work out a way to make the Files app more like Finder, then I think that would be a really useful march forward. Again, just making this iPad that little bit more user-friendly. I mentioned when I bought my iPad, I also picked up 2 of the accessories. I got the Pencil Pro and the Magic Keyboard. Now, I say they're options. They're kind of not, are they? Not really. Let's look at the keyboard first. You really couldn't think of buying an iPad Pro and not having a keyboard with it. Now, you could decide to go the non-Apple route, but I would question whether it would get any better than this. Like the iPad, it had makeovers last year, and it's just a really premium product to use. One of the big downers of the keyboard is the price. It is ridiculously expensive, a £350 option to buy along with your iPad Pro. It is an eye-watering amount to spend on the keyboard. Is it worth it? It pains me to say yes, almost, but there is another problem with the case, and that is the bulk that it brings to the iPad. This iPad is so slim now, it's so lightweight. I mean, it's about the same thickness as the display on a MacBook Pro. It's super, super slim. It feels gorgeous, and itself only weighs 582 grams. But believe it or not, the Magic Keyboard, that hasn't got a display, hasn't got a battery, weighs more. That weighs 660 grams. So you put the two together, suddenly you're looking at kind of MacBook Pro territory for weight. And this thing is supposed to be portable and mobile. So as good as the keyboard is, it is a hefty accessory to put on. Just bear that in mind if you're going to be carrying it around town all day long in a backpack. But would I be without it? Absolutely not. It's a must-have. Now, as much as that's a must-have, and I've already mentioned it has its flaws, like, for instance, in Grammarly, I mentioned that there's issues there, and sometimes I find I can't place the cursor exactly where I want to. It seems to stall more in third-party apps than in native Apple apps, but that is the only issue I've had with the keyboard itself. I've got very little other than praise or other than those couple of issues I've mentioned. The Pencil, on the other hand, much like ProMotion, I'm not really the target audience for the Pencil. I'm not an artist, I don't draw, but it is useful to have. Now, I bought the Pencil Pro. It's great. I can use it with the iPad mini as well. It doubles up. I can switch it and use it with the iPad mini. That's fantastic. You can buy cheaper options. I've had viewers telling me they bought other options that once you've connected them up via a USB-C cable, it recognizes it quickly enough and they work well. For me, I always tend to buy original Apple gear. I've kind of learned in the test of time, they last better, they wear better, they sync better, the user experience is better. Yes, you do pay a bit more for it, certainly in the case of the keyboard, but you kind of do get what you pay for at the end of the day. I thought it might be interesting, though, to see if Apple are putting any incentives or hurdles in our way of switching over to working on iPad if we looked at cost. And let's face it, cost matters to us all. As I said, I buy all this gear myself, so it's costing me exactly the same money as it's costing you. So I'm going to spec up a MacBook Pro, an M4 MacBook Pro, as closely as I can to this iPad. A 14-inch M4 MacBook Pro with a 10-core CPU and a 10-core GPU, 16 gigs of memory and 512 gigs of storage will cost you £1,599. By comparison, a 13-inch M4 iPad Pro with a 9-core CPU and a 10-core GPU, only 8 gigs of memory and 512 gigs of storage will cost you £1,499. But by the time you add on the Magic Keyboard and the Pencil, that's £1,977, which is almost £400 more expensive than the MacBook Pro. We are talking about two very different beasts here. There's always going to be Mac users and iPad users, so I don't think it will necessarily see a hit in their sales. But if you want to entice people to begin working on iPad, surely incentivize. Now, I've come up with this idea. It might be a bad idea, I don't know. I just want to run it past you. Let's say you're in the store and you're going to buy the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte version because you want Nano-texture. They've locked that down. If you want Nano-texture, you have to buy those more expensive models. On that day of purchase, at that moment you're at the checkout in store, why don't they incentivize and greatly reduce, maybe up to 50%, the price of buying the Pencil and the Magic Keyboard along with it? That way you're getting a real bargain. And also, although you're being forced to get the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte models to get the Nano-texture, you kind of feel like you're getting something for nothing. I don't know if it's a bad idea, but I just think they need to do something to make the iPad more of an attractive proposition to go and buy and tempt people away from Mac to work on. This iPad Pro was the first device that Apple put the M4 silicon chip in, and it is quick. The chip inside of this iPad I've got here is the 10-core CPU, 10-core GPU. It's got the same 16-core neural engine as on the MacBooks, and it's got a 120 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth as well, which goes some way to explaining why this thing always feels so fast. It's whether you're opening up apps, whether you've got multi-apps open, whatever window you're using, everything just seems fast. Every bit the equal of a Mac, and it's great, really great to work on. With the addition, of course, you've got touchscreen and the pencil, which is kind of what, certainly when it comes to photo editing, draws me, apart from the screen, to working on the iPad. Now, if my workflow was a little bit different, and I wasn't always so reliant on working in video and audio, I think there's a very good chance I might be switching over to working on an iPad. As Apple Silicon continues to develop, I think we're now going to see iPad come of age. Finally, I think we're going to see the computer in the iPad that we've always wanted and always hoped it could be. Finally, the iPad is coming of age. And you know, sometimes different is just better. I don't think they ever want the iPad to be a Mac, which is why we're not going to get macOS on it. They are different, but a change sometimes is a good thing. If you've enjoyed this video, there's another video on screen now where I'm telling you all about benefits of working on an M4 iPad Pro, which I think you might find pretty enjoyable.